So welcome back to the first session after lunch. My name is Sandra Sirota. I'm a postdoctoral research here with the Humility and Conviction Public Life Project. And I'd like to welcome our first speaker, Sheff, Adjunct Professor of Philosophy here at the University of Connecticut. And his title is the First Year Seminar on Navigating Controversy.
Hello. This is just sort of a broad overview of a first year seminar that I gave a couple of years ago here on just sort of like political disagreement, sort of like broadly construed, with a little bit of a focus on conflicts between science and religion. It was 2 years ago, and at the time I didn't know that 2 years later I would be giving a presentation on it. I guess I did kind of I sign up for this, so it's my fault, but I did. So I accept responsibility, but I am also a little just, there was stuff to talk about though. I'm really happy with how it turned out. I do, all things considered, have fond memories of this experience. So I'm gonna just sort of share them with you, tell you sort of what I learned along the way, a little bit about what I think worked and maybe what didn't. As sort of a broader part of the Humility and Conviction project, the sort of basic idea was that you'd have a first year seminar at UConn. They're called like a first year experience, or FYE. And the first year seminar would be about sort of controversy and argument, which obviously fits in, very perfectly with the concerns of the project. Mine was in spring of 2017. Another member of the project, Hannah Gunn, also taught a version of the seminar. It had 9 students in it. We met once a week for 50 minutes. It was a 1-credit course, actually in a building next door. The setting, I would say, was pretty low stakes. As an FYE, there's, you're not really expected to like grade harshly or anything. So really the whole goal is to kind of make people comfortable talking with each other, get people to sort of feel okay addressing controversial topics. And then, just kind of, the goal was then that magic would happen or something. We'd all make a breakthrough, right? But in any event, right, like the FYE setting was supposed to be really conducive to that. So I tried to play that up as much as I could. So the really basic goal, the whole point of the sort of FYE as I conceived it, and as Hannah conceived it as well, was to introduce students to the norms of argument, kind of reflect as a group on examples of arguments or controversies, public controversies, and then specifically any controversies pertaining to conflicts between like science and religion were kind of preferred or played up, received extra focus. Really the kind of overarching view was just to kind of focus on any sort of public dispute, disputes where you'd be likely to see some sort of flashpoints between people of different opinions. The examples of arguments provided by the students, as we'll see, are kind of meant to really be the substance of the course. The course description, which I had here, this was sort of at the top of this syllabus. I said this: argument often sounds like a bad thing. After all, who wants to be known as an argumentative person? But they're not necessarily bad. Arguments are a key component of social life, especially in an educational context. Arguments can be conducted well with geniality or focus, and they can go really badly too, with people talking past one another. This course is about arguments, how to recognize them, how to evaluate them. The course has both theoretical and practical components. On some weeks, we'll read excerpts from Why We Argue, and in the next week, we will use what we learned to interpret findings in the wild. These are the examples collected by students. Things from like social media, news media, YouTube, etc. So that was sort of the pitch to the students, kind of get them interested in it. That was the self-image of the course. The format worked like this. It was kind of an on-off sort of schedule. So on 1 week, like I said in the description, we discuss a chapter from Why We Argue and How We Should by Aiken and Talise. And then on the following week, students would send in material from various online sources. So these would be things that they find on social media, things that they might see on YouTube, things they might find in the news, really just about anything they could come up with. If they thought it reminded them of the class, if it seemed like it would be relevant for the class and they wanted to talk about it some more, then they would send that in by email, and I would go through their examples and kind of pick and choose like which one seems to resonate most strongly with the stuff that we talked about last week. And then we kind of go from there. Those 50-minute sessions would be the ones where, again, the sort of dream was to kind of open the floor and then magic would happen. Sometimes that did happen, not always. So that was what we called like the field work portion of the class, where they would go out and sort of find stuff that they thought was relevant and bring it in. So if that was YouTube, Reddit, Twitter, Facebook, anything whatsoever, as long as they thought it was relevant, I would field it and check it out. So the textbook is Why We Argue and How We Should by Scott Aiken and Robert Talise. Comes in 2 parts, and it's a nice short little book. I really like it. The first part of the book is kind of a rational reconstruction of how argument works and what it's for, the whole social function of argument and its sort of role in our lives, our political lives. And then the second part of the book, which I focused on heavily with the students, is all about sort of displaying or explaining different types of fallacious arguments in action, and then showing why they're bad, or at least showing the context in which they're bad, and maybe the context in which they have some sort of other dialectical role to play. So I'll probably say this later on, but I use this book in ethics courses. I used it in my Intro to Philosophy course this semester. It's a good time. I like this book. I'm strongly in favor.
Rob, you're also working as Rob's agent.
Right. Just so you know, slight conflict of interest. Buy this book. I will make it.
There's a new edition too.
So I've mentioned the fieldwork a lot. When we didn't discuss the book, we discussed materials found by the students on different internet resources. One of them that I'll talk about was a redacted argument from Facebook between people in a comment section. So like I told everyone, like, if you don't want to blow your amp's cover or something like that, and you think this is a really great example, but you don't want to like show names or anything, then I will accept, exchanges between people on Facebook, and you can block out the names or whatever. That's fine. Another example that stands out in my memory was a video that someone saw in their Facebook newsfeed of Ben Shapiro owning the libs with facts and logic. This was like the video where he's like well, every video is him talking really fast, but this one in particular was about him talking to some young woman who's asking a question at a talk he's giving, and something about the Boy Scouts, and it's very strange. But we talked about it, right? And it was important to me that we kind of address this, because my guess is this was not the only person to ever encounter a Ben Shapiro video in the wild. So, that's something you probably want to have something to say about in a class about arguments and, I guess, broadly speaking, facts and logic. So, a student found, like I said, the Ben Shapiro video on their Facebook news feed. They emailed it to me prior to class. So it was something that they thought was relevant to the class, relevant to what we've been talking about. And we all watched it together to talk not about whether Shapiro was right, but just about whether what you saw in the video was effective in any way, or whether there were parts about it that were ineffective. Because the material was like potentially politically volatile, I put heavy qualifications sort of out there beforehand. I said I wanted to let them know like I'm not showing you this because I agree with it or anything, but this is something that is out there, and we want to sort of see why it works or why it doesn't work, essentially. And so I showed them the video, and then we discussed it as a group. So what were some of the highlights of the course, or some of the sort of high points of the course? So every chapter in Why We Argue ends with various discussion questions. So it kind of like goes over different kinds of arguments, or different kinds of fallacies, or different points like that. And then it just kind of ends on sort of points for further thought for students. And one of the chapters is on pushover arguments, or straw man arguments. These are arguments that are kind of deliberately easy to knock down, so that, well, in some contexts, so that you can sort of make your opponents look very easy to disprove, and as a result make your own position look really, really good in comparison. But one of the things that Aiken and Talese ask is, what should be done in cases where an especially weak argument in favor of a view that one opposes also happens to be the most popular among one's opposition? So it might turn out, for example, that your opposition endorses very heartily an argument that is really easy to refute. If someone, for example, if a creationist sort of says in defense of their view that it's supported by the Bible, and the Bible's true because God wrote it, then that's not good, right? But you also don't want to sort of represent your opponent as someone who is like so invested in an argument that's really bad, right? So one student noticed that there's something interesting kind of going on under the hood here of this question, and really under the hood of like the whole book. So one of the things that's mentioned very early on in the first chapter, I believe, of the book, is that arguing with someone is a way of sort of demonstrating respect to that person. In the following sense, when you argue with somebody, you're trying to bring them around to the view that you take to be the correct view. And you're not doing this necessarily because you want to look like the smarter person, but you're doing this because everyone has a basic interest in knowing the truth. And hey, if other people are, if other people have the same needs and interests you do, then they will probably want to know the truth too. So, by arguing with someone and presenting them with the reasons that you consider to be really good support for what you consider to be the right view, you are trying to look out for their best interest. That sounds nice. I mean, I think that's correct. But my student pointed out that according to Aiken and Talese, at least as she was reading it and as I was kind of reading them as well, you'd be doing your opposition, your opponents, a disservice by letting them buy into a bad argument for their view, especially when there are so many better arguments for their view out there, even if you take those arguments to be flawed as well. But, as we see earlier on, the spirit of argument is about trying to direct other people to truth. It's about trying to get people to see, the right way of seeing things. So, if I'm in a disagreement with, let's say, a creationist, and they give me a really bad argument, a pushover argument, then I don't really just want to sort of, disprove their view flatly and say like, well, that's a terrible argument for your view, so much for that. I might say instead something like, well, you know, there are other views out there, or there are other arguments for your view, like a fine-tuning argument or something like that. That might be really dialectically appropriate for me as someone who's trying to avoid making my, you know, conversation partner look like a dupe. But on the other hand, right, if my interest is in looking out for people's, you know, cognitive hygiene, if I'm trying to direct people to the truth, then directing someone to an argument that I still take to be leading to a falsehood is kind of a bad idea, or at least it seems to go against the spirit of argument. So, what I thought was really cool about that was that, you know, that to me seemed like a really sophisticated point. I was very happy to have someone bring that up spontaneously. I shared this interaction with Michael, who then shared it with Robert Police and Scott Aiken, and they were very happy to hear that, you know, someone took this kind of slow ball over the plate and really connected with it and knocked it out of the park. I was also really happy with it. This is like one of those times as an instructor where you're like, oh man, this is awesome. Maybe I'm good at this job. Surprisingly, I think the Ben Shapiro discussion went really well. It gave me an opportunity to talk about begging the question. Everyone kind of agreed. Like, I really wanted to stay away from asking people to engage in like the substance of the talk, of like the video. But everyone kind of agreed that, like, yeah, okay, you know, talking really fast so that your opponent can't get a word in edgewise is probably not cool. Yeah, you know, once you see what begging the question is, that's not great either. So I think, you know, I thought that went well, and it could have gone really badly, but it didn't, which I was pleased about. I don't want to accidentally turn anyone into a Ben Shapiro fan. That was my concern. So what can I say about the course as a whole? To me, for anyone who's sort of interested in doing things like this or wants to take away similar things from this, I think the most effective part of it was the field work. That was really great. I mean, I also do, again, really advocate for why we argue, independent of my financial interests. Just kidding. I do think it's really good, but I think to me probably the best part of it was the field work and sort of letting students have a say in sort of just the direction of the course generally, letting them have a say in how the discussions went. That was really great. I can't really, you know, say much more in detail than that because this is now a couple of years past. And, it was a small class, so it wouldn't have been very good as a like sample size or anything. But just sort of, you know, really big picture. Field work, I think, is fantastic. Letting people make use of social media in sort of, you know, understanding norms of argument is really cool. So, yeah, A+ would teach again. That was kind of my feel. So, anyway, thanks a lot. That's what I learned.
Now I'd like to welcome Manuela Wagner, Associate Professor of Foreign Language Education here at University of Connecticut, and her talk is entitled The Role of Intellectual Humility in Intercultural Citizenship and Vice Versa.
Thank you. In my prior academic life, no, in the same academic life but a little earlier, I studied humor. I should have gone to philosophy classes, or at least presentations. Thank you.
This is a good day.
Thank you so much. Okay, welcome. Thank you so much. Is it good to come up after lunch? I was wondering when I saw the schedule. So I decided to not have much of my voice and show you quite a few sound bits from our teachers. So that's why you hear a lot of teachers later on. I wanted to show you some data. First of all, thank you, Michael. Thank you, Humility and Conviction Project and John Templeton Foundation to make this work possible. I did this together with Fabiana Cardetti and in a lot of consultation with Michael Byram, our colleague, and our own Heather Beckley. Here you are. I might call on you every once in a while. Okay, so as you saw, we are going to talk about intercultural citizenship. That's something that's very close to my heart. Since the time is rather short, and please feel free to give me warnings. I want to make sure I'm not taking up more time. I'm not going to go into very much detail. I hope I give you enough detail for you to understand what we did in the project. So here you see a definition that Mike and I gave for actually an encyclopedia where we said intercultural citizenship is really the combinations of skills, knowledge and attitudes necessary for a person to engage in social action based on an awareness of other perspectives on the object and aims of that action, where other refers to different cultural groups, normally with different languages. I gave that definition here. Michael, of course, Michael Byram, and I need to differentiate Michael here because when we say Michael, we often think of Michael Lynch, created this theory of intercultural citizenship in 2008. And what it really means is applying intercultural competence, so asking students to apply intercultural competence in the here and now. So we don't just teach them intercultural competence and later on we hope they apply it sometime. It actually combines civics, theories of civics, of action in the here and now. We're not telling students what to do. We are not telling students what to think. We just want them to take a problem in their society and deal with it in some way based on specific criteria that they will figure out. I'll give you examples in a little bit. Just a brief overview how we conceptualize intercultural competence. Intercultural competence, often because of the word competence that could be talked about quite a bit, is seen as knowledge, but it's really much more than that. Knowledge is part of that. And as you can see here, so knowledge is one. Is it not? Okay, that's interesting. So knowledge is one part of this on the left-hand side, but there are also skills of interpreting and relating. That means I interpret a document from another culture related to my own. I discover and interact in languages, in foreign languages, often in another language in real time, which you could see is not so easy always. In order to do so, and there's an interesting discussion going on, what needs to be there first? Do I first need to be open and curious in order to do all those things? Or can I do these things and I become more open, right? And look at more perspectives. So that's another interesting discussion. But of course, there needs to be some curiosity, openness, tolerance of ambiguity to do this. And hopefully, this all will lead to critical cultural awareness. So in language education, we don't just want to have students who say, oh, I'm so tolerant, it's all good, right? We want students who look at events and make a judgment based on specific criteria, and I often add, from multiple perspectives. Okay, now, intellectual humility. There's nothing like talking about intellectual humility in a room of experts. But here it is. We take the definition from the Humility and Public Life project. The way we got into intellectual humility is we have been doing intercultural citizenship projects for a while. And when I heard more about intellectual humility, there was just so much overlap in terms of what we want to do in intercultural citizenship education and what one would like to do probably in intellectual humility education. And as you can see here, involving one's own cognitive limitations, if I'm exposed to something new, need to look at a different perspective, depth to others, low concern for domination, and of course it has to do with democracy is also important for us. We are talking about intercultural citizenship. A lot of the work that we do is concerned with enabling students to participate in democratic dialogue, right? So you see some connections. We looked at some more connections. What we then did is, so first, and I'm not talking about this here much, but we looked at language education and what intellectual humility has to do with language education. Because even on a linguistic basis, if you are exposed to something, it means something else, there's a different word for this. So already there you can see that a certain intellectual humility is necessary, that it would foster that, right? But we went a little bit deeper and then really looked at connections, and after looking at different theories of intellectual humility, the paper by Heather and colleagues, Whitcomb et al., helped us quite a bit, because they are descriptors of what you could expect a person who is intellectually humble to also show, what characteristics there are. And so we went through the different descriptors and looked at what is similar in intercultural citizenship education. I'm just giving you a couple of examples. I'm trying to lay out the theory, the theoretical background, so that you can understand the study that we did, the pilot study. But I'm not going into all detail. But here, for example, the first descriptor is IH increases a person's propensity to admit to his intellectual limitations to himself and others. And we feel that that really works well with critical cultural awareness, which is part of intercultural competence. You're aware of your own ideological perspectives. In order to be critically culturally aware and really compare something based on specific criteria, you need to be aware of that. You need to make an evaluative analysis, right? So we felt that works well. Another example is IH increases a person's concern about her own intellectual weaknesses and mistakes, right? That to some degree often correlates with those attitudes of curiosity, openness. There's a certain vulnerability if I'm open to other perspectives. So those are just two examples. Is everybody still with me? Why we compared the two? Yeah, okay. So then we did a study. What we wanted to find out is really, how do these intercultural citizenship, intellectual humility connections play out in classrooms? So are there relationships? And if there are, how can we better serve our students to teach this, in short? So in other words, do we already teach intellectual humility when we teach intercultural citizenship? Right? Or if we teach more intellectual humility, can we enhance intercultural citizenship skills? That's our question, and of course we did not expect to fully answer it. We're getting a stab at it at the beginning. So what we planned to do was the following. We worked collaboratively with teachers. I've had some connections with teachers prior, Fabiana as well. Fabiana is a mathematician, Fabiana Cadetti. And so we worked with math teachers and foreign language teachers. It ended up being more foreign language teachers than math teachers. What we tried to do ideally is have teachers who either have two sections of the same level, of the same class basically, and teach one intercultural citizenship unit and one intercultural citizenship unit that also infuses intellectual humility. Make sense? It didn't always work out. We were happy in the end if we had teachers who, for example, if it was a second teacher who had the same level, we tried to do that too. So real life worked out. It wasn't as clean as we would have liked it to be, but that was the attempt. Prior to the implementation of that unit that we planned together, we did the IH limitations owning survey. Heather was also part of this. Heather did not tell us to use those things. We just thought they were so good that we then used them. Then we did the implementation. We collected the student work. We did the post survey again. And we did the survey with both groups, the IH group and the non-IH group, if that's clear. And we did interviews with teachers. And today, because we have not collected all the data yet, there's some still ongoing, I'm going to show you some excerpts from the teachers, mostly. Okay, so the data corpus is curricular units, pre-post surveys, students' reflections, classwork, and teacher interviews. That's what we're going to have in the end. to talk about. Okay, here are some examples of units. I'm mostly going to refer to the sports unit and a little bit to the Hurricane Maria unit. So our units are really based on real world problems, real life issues. In total, when all of this is over, we'll have impacted about 180 students through this, in one way or another. Okay, so here are the numbers of what we have at the moment. But I'd like to actually really go to the sound bites. So this is a German teacher. We asked her, so we've done intercultural competence projects before, but not with the group. She had a group of German students come visit, exchange students, for a couple of weeks. They were here, and that was a coincidence, but we planned it so that we included them, because if you talk about intercultural competence in a language course and you have students from Germany here, you're talking about their culture, you have experts of the culture right here and there, you can ask them. So we planned a project, and I'm happy to talk a little bit about what we planned, but I'd really like you to hear what she said, what was different than other years when they did not do that. And she also did this intellectual humility intervention. And now I need to click on this.
The kids tended to be way more competitive.
Can you have a little louder?
Yeah, but only on there.
Thank you so much.
In previous years, the kids tended to be way more competitive. Mm-hmm. And one of their goals was always, we want to play a soccer game against the Germans. We want to play against the Germans. And we did go out and play this year, but it was, in some senses it was a chaotic mess, because the teams kept mixing back, and like kids would go in, kids would go out. Oh wait, so you're on the German side now? Okay, now you're on the American side. It was a mess. The game really didn't work, because Capstone and I couldn't keep track of so wait, what's your team now? But wait, you were playing for them, now you're with them.
You needed special shirts.
I know, we needed shirts or something. We could not keep track because they kept.
But that's good.
They mixing all around, and the game never really happened.
Did they think that was, were they bummed for not having done an actual competition, or were they excited to have done the competition?
They just had a great time. They were just having fun, and interacting with each other. Where, in the past, there was one year it got to the point, it was supposed to be one of my classes, I think it was one of my German 4s, against the exchange group, and all of a sudden these kids I didn't know showed up on the field. I didn't know who they were. And I went over to one of the kids who seemed to be interacting with them. I'm like, so Davey, what's the deal? Who are these people? Oh, they're helping us win. So he felt like he was a varsity soccer player, and he got almost the rest of the team to come, because
Okay, you get an idea. So there was something quite different that year, that all of a sudden it was not us versus them anymore. And this is, of course, just one example, but nonetheless it's interesting. I'm gonna see if I can play this one. This is about a little bit about how they thought about, we had this activity, structured activity, where they found out about different topics related to sports. And they had to go out and really either confirm what they believed or disconfirm what they believed. And here it's about sports scholarships. Of course, in Germany, that's not such a big topic that you get a sports scholarship to the university.
Some of the sports with which the kids were less familiar, like climbing, like handball, and think about what don't you know? Mm-hmm. What don't you know about this? And how do you feel about? I think some kids really thought about school sports for the first time, because one thing that blew the German kids' minds was the notion of sports scholarships. Mm-hmm. And they're like, what do you mean? They pay for you to go to the university because you can play football, right? Like that seems so bizarre. And that was one of our survey questions that we had the stats. And it was interesting, then some of the American kids really started to think about that. And they came down on the side of, well, maybe there shouldn't be sports scholarships. And then the Germans all of a sudden thought it was great. They see American universities being so expensive, and, well, what do you mean? Like, I can play tennis, so it'd be cheaper for me because I can play tennis. So both, I think some kids really thought about schools.
Okay. A few more minutes. So this is a longer video, but I might actually not show this. This is the math teacher. It's a middle school teacher really talking about the difficulties sometimes of doing those projects. She wants to do it again. Her students were really excited. Months later, they still talked about that unit, and she said, wait, they're still talking about the Hurricane Maria unit. It's a few months later. But sometimes it being difficult because of structural issues to do this again.
That you would like.
But I wanted to go to the next one. So there is a lot of ongoing work. We're still collecting data, we're analyzing data. We haven't done the quantitative analysis at all because we don't have it all yet. It's exciting that teachers are really excited. Teachers presented on this work already. We're going to co-present on some of this work. So there's a lot more to come, but I would like to end with one video. I think I have one more minute, and it might not even be a minute. And I have a couple of other sound bites later on if you have questions, if you want to catch me somewhere. But this one I thought was just really telling. And here the question is really, what do you think the addition of intellectual humility did to this work?
No, I mean, I have to say, just kind of because of the way like the world is going, I felt really good and really confident, like having a vehicle. You know, teaching German is great, but there were days when I felt wonderful. It was almost more important to me to have this vehicle to get kids to recognize what they don't know and for them to be okay with that. Like, you're not going to know everything. And if you start making assumptions about languages and about cultures, you're going to, probably really get yourself into trouble and embarrass yourself and make some sort of faux pas. Or, B, you're never going to learn it because you're going to be basing everything on your assumption. So I think giving kids the tools to recognize what they don't know and having those really good moments of like, well, I don't know, but I'm going to go ask Manuela because she's German, and then going to her and she doesn't know either, that it's okay not to know things. And
that's where I want to stop. Thank you so much. But I wanted to maybe say also, if we think about language education, sometimes the focus can be quite a bit on language education. I want to very much move away from this and really say we do things with language. We do, well, Wittgenstein was right, I think, right? We do things with words. But more so, really do something in the world today, and to give this teacher the tools, where she says it's really wonderful to have these tools to get my students engaged. And what came out of that conversation for me also is to not have that pressure in our educational system, and Lani, I think, will have liked it as well, not to always have to know the answer, but to be able to be vulnerable and take a step back and be curious and find out. That for me already, before I see many other results, is a pretty big deal. I'm pretty happy that we were able to engage in this. So thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, that's perfect timing from both speakers, so we have 20 minutes for questions. Lonnie?
Thanks. So yeah, just what you mentioned briefly about using real-world problems in the units, and I just wanted to really just invite you to say a bit more about why using real-world problems was helping. What you feel that was doing in the course in order to facilitate the effects that you were trying to have.
Okay, so the question is what it is about the real world problems that would be helpful. So I think in language education there's sometimes the danger, language and culture education, we can do so much with language, right? Everything we do is through language, but if there's a focus on the form of the language and the language learning itself, we can forget. So, you know, I might get into the habit where I ask you, what color is my blazer? And you know it full well what color my blazer is. I'm just asking you so that you practice black and blazer and your maybe, right? So what we're really doing more and more in language education is to learn through the language, content-based language approach. But I want to move further, and colleagues, what we did in those projects with, even with math education, language education as well, and other science, social sciences, social studies, is to take real world problems that the students are engaged in, that they have an interest in, to really challenge them cognitively and say, what can I do with the knowledge I'm learning here and with the skills I'm learning here in the real world? I don't want to wait anymore for my students to apply something later on and to put the things in the different classrooms together and always have those classroom walls. I really want to, and that sounds extreme in a way, or it sounds for many not extreme, but to really break down the classroom walls, the school walls, and learn for life and do something for the here and now. And there's opposition to that to some degree. It's not opposition-less. There are colleagues who are not comfortable with that. And then there are people who do it and who wouldn't want to do it any other way anymore, right? So I think there are camps. What it does really for me, I think it gets students engaged. If it's something that they care about, I cannot tell them this is what you do. If possible, I try to get to a topic with the students. That's not always possible. So in this, we really consulted with the teachers who knew their students. But if possible, the more student-centered it is, the more it comes from them. This is what I care about, this is what I want to learn about, this is what I want to find out, the better in my opinion.
Yes, it's doing a kind of motivation piece.
The motivation, they're talking about it outside of class. In that class with the Hurricane Maria, where they did the math, the teacher said the students were talking about it outside of class. They were preparing packages. Oh, we should have taken this, we should have taken that. We hear the same thing about case method, right? I was in a case method class myself after I graduated, and I called colleagues after that class in the evening and said, I forgot about that, because you get so engaged, right? So I think it's that motivation piece that I'm learning because I really want to learn, and not because somebody tells me you have to know this on the test.
I was wondering what particular challenges you faced when you were trying to get students to learn how to argue and argue well. Anything in particular?
I think part of it is the challenge that you kind of have in any classroom, which is just sort of getting people okay with kind of like putting themselves on the line and making a commitment to a certain view or a certain kind of argument, or even just like saying this is an okay argumentative move to make. There really wasn't that much in the way of, like, I guess this is something that I would have changed about it, is there wasn't much in the way of asking people to sort of make their own case for something. I never really did that. It was just about sort of evaluating, you know, the fieldwork examples that people brought in. A lot of the time though, yeah, I mean, something like just being willing to put yourself out there as saying, like, here's something that I don't think is right with this, or people were okay saying what they thought was okay with it. So like one of the, that like redacted Facebook post, for example, was supposed to be an instance of an exchange that the student thought went well, even though it was a disagreement. It wasn't like acrimonious in any way. So people were pretty fine making sort of like, I guess, like positive evaluations, but I think there was a little hesitation for saying anything negative. Nobody wants to go negative. Once you do, it's all negative.
I know this really gets back to the motivational piece, and I love what you said about questioning what comes first in order to do this work, whether to offer the skills of interpreting first, or just offering the opportunity to kind of authentically understand that I don't know something.
Mm-hmm.
And it really reminds me of a dialogue we did in our class last week on asking our students to speak about their experiences with individuals from other racial groups before they came to Tufts University. And after class, and there were some students in the room, some of the white students who had never been involved in that conversation before. So afterwards, a few students came up to me and said, how can we have this conversation without offering racial literacy up front?
Mm-hmm.
And I said, I totally understand that, but in some ways, people don't realize that they need this until they feel unskilled. So kind of letting that emerge in a more authentic way. So my question for you is, when you think about the balance in your experience in doing this, and you're challenged by either offering the skills of interpretation first versus letting people have that experience of being open to what they don't know, where do you see the balance between the two, and where the tensions, and how do you decide in certain circumstances and topics what should come first?
Thank you so much. It's such a great question. I don't have an absolute answer what should come first. It really is a case-by-case basis, on a case-by-case basis. I think what works and sometimes it doesn't work. So with this work, it was fairly scaffolded, and the intervention was not very long even. So I'm surprised that the teacher had this experience where she really felt something different happened from other years, and from where she really had this, so it wasn't even very, very long, right? The reason why I say that is he or she decided, we gave this and we decided together first we tried to make them curious. So we gave them statements and asked them to either agree or disagree, and then we told them now go out and find out. So it was a scaffolded activity where there were Faktendetektive, we called it in German, detectives for facts, and they really tried to find out what is behind what they believe to be true first. And they asked different students, and then sometimes even the German students didn't know, or they had conflicting information, so it was pretty rich ground for such a short activity. When I do this myself, I think I'm pretty merciless. I throw people into it as well. I don't always give the interpretation first. I try to make curious first as well, I think. But there is resistance towards that from some of the students. Some students really, really like it, and some tell me, I'd like to know first before I even say anything. So there is does that relate to what, yeah, so there is resistance on that part. But if I have a relationship with the students, and if I can build one, I think there's a giving and a taking, and I'm learning from them when I can throw them, and when I have to give something first.
Nate, I was wondering if you talked at all in your class about the limitations of argument in the public square in particular, and brought up that issue that sometimes it's not a good idea to argue. So I mean, sometimes in some places, you know, argument is good and necessary in philosophy classes and debates. But if you encounter a creationist in the public square who's just, God said it, it's true, is it even worth? I mean, which isn't to say you just walk away, right? There are other ways you can interact on a friend basis, or change the subject, become friends, or ask them questions. Oh, tell me about your religion. Why, you know? So I was just wondering if you talked about that.
My guess is we probably did, and it just doesn't stick out in my mind. Because that is one of the things that I think it comes at sort of the end of one of the chapters of the book, which is, you know, are there maybe times when debate isn't worth it, or when it's maybe not a good idea to kind of push the issue. And that is probably, I think that's almost certainly something we did talk about, but it's the kind of thing I didn't really keep records of, so it just doesn't stick out in my mind.
May I say something to the last question? Actually, something that came to mind. It's very brief. Something that came to mind, and that's not based on this project, because that question we didn't ask. That would be a very good question to add, actually. But based on our experience, prior experience, and my own experience doing this work, I think the key for me is that while in other cases, when I don't do work this way, where the students are doing problems that they're solving to some degree, they might not be so interested even in doing this interpreting work. They might not go out and look for answers to certain things, or they might do it more reluctantly. So that interpretive work, I think, is just so much more intensive when they're engaged, when they have the personal interest in it. So I think in the end, whether that discovering and interacting comes first, or that interpreting and relating, as soon as they know this is the end goal and I'm really doing something, I think there might be more interest, in my experience, for that, doing that hard work, because it's not so easy to find out about something.
So I just, Manuela, I think you covered it a little bit in response to Jonathan's question, but I was interested to hear more about the interventions that you did, and whether did you use a couple different interventions, or were they different in the different, I mean, math is very, you know, the math course and the German courses, those are very different types of courses, even when you're, you know, so I'd just like to know more about
that. I'm just going to one slide here. So these are the different units that we had. We had a German wellness and math unit that was mostly about sports. So German wellness and math were the subjects that were engaged. We had 2 Hurricane Maria units, one in math and one in Spanish, unfortunately not with the same students, so those were different classes. A healthcare unit that's going to be taught, and an immigration unit that's going to be taught. And the way this works is that together with the teachers, we figured out topics within those topics that would be interesting for the students. And we tried to guide them towards developing this critical cultural awareness. So having to, in the end, to say, so here's what I think about this, here's the statement that I make about it. And with the health unit, for example, there's then also this active part where the German students went back to Germany and gave a presentation about what they learned about sports in America. The students here in America gave a presentation in front of students who were not all engaged with the exchange, right, and talked about, here's what we learned. So for example, one statement in the sports that might come out of left field, if I'm using that right, that is there's no racism in sports, right? And that's a topic that is interesting in Germany and here, I would think. And the students had to think about that. And we were hoping that the students then go out and really do something with that as well. And we know that the teacher...
But I was thinking about it, specifically the intellectual humility intervention.
And so the intellectual humility intervention, what we did is we created a handout for teachers, because we did not have a whole lot of time. We couldn't expect the teachers to spend a lot of time with us and doing workshops and those kinds of things. So what we did is we created a handout and we said, here's what intellectual humility is. We met with them also and talked about it to some degree. And then we said, for example, let's take a look at some of the characteristics of intellectual humility. And then with the characteristics, so let's say, for example, it reduces the propensity to know, to pretend to know something when you don't really know something. And what we did then is we created an activity. Here's what I know. So those tables that you know, the K, W, L tables. Here's what I know. Here's what I would like to learn. And so we asked the students to fill this out about this topic. What do you know already? What do you think you need to know? What would you like to learn? And then we worked the students through this. So we had another activity where with the intellectual humility, a lot of it was reflection. So we asked the students, what did you find out that you didn't know before? How did you find it out? How did you feel when you didn't know something? Right. So we did a lot of that reflection part. I'm looking if there's something else that we did here. How will you go about learning something in the future, right? So we did some meta-cognitive work with them in terms of the intellectual humility part. So it was not a very long intervention. And frankly, it was hard for us to do something in addition to the intercultural citizenship work that we normally do, because some of this we do, right? Because it is important in intercultural citizenship to find out, to make sure that the information you have is not just based on one fact. That's part of intercultural citizenship as it is. So some of it was artificial separation as well. of what, does that make sense?
Of the concepts. Of
Yes.
Intercultural
Yes.
competence and intellectual
Yes,
humility.
yeah.
Just one last quick, you probably said this, what were the ages of the?
So we had middle school and we had high school.
Yeah, hi. So I take it the reason you did the IH scale both pre and post was to see whether the course had like an effect on
Yeah, so,
students. But it's a bit paradoxical because if it's a trait scale, then if the results differ wildly from time to time, it lacks test-retest validity. But that you also don't want to assume that traits can't change at all.
right.
But this seems like a pretty minor intervention
Yes.
to have a significant effect.
We are aware of that.
Okay.
So we are aware of the issue, and Heather, if you want to say something about that as well. So
Defend your
So-
scale.
not to defend the scale, but we actually decided to choose the scale. So we wanted to test intellectual humility somewhat quantitatively as well, right? And the scale had items that seemed to work best that the students could relate to as well. And so we are aware that this is not an ideal intervention in any way. It's basically our first step at looking at what this looks like to do it with teachers, and it's really a pilot study.
Okay.
So we're not thinking that we would get huge results. We don't have them yet, so I couldn't tell you. We have many of the pre, but we don't have the post yet.
Okay. And do the items on the scale, do they work for school children? Are there items that presuppose that you're like an adult who's had certain life
that's a
experiences?
Good question. Where's Ben?
Yeah, I'm over here. My name's on that scale too. So. Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to think of, like, we didn't consciously have a grade level built in when the items were getting written, but
Sure. But like the Big Five has a child version as well.
Right. What was the age exactly of the students?
So middle school, 7th grade.
Yeah, I mean, it was definitely the youngest sample that has used it. So in some ways, I'm kind of curious how
So
reliable
most-
it ends up being for them.
Most
but-
are high school.
Yeah. So I mean, we definitely consciously don't have advanced language just for because you want, people without high school degrees to be able to answer this. So the reading level shouldn't be that high, but so it should work okay.
But it's entirely fair to say that the scale items were not designed with children specifically in mind.
Yeah. So no sample has shown that it's reliable with that age.
Okay. Just curious.
But this month, so.
Probably not big enough in terms of a sample, but.
Right, we have 1 minute left, and maybe Brendan will have to be the last question.
It's actually just it's a structural question for Nate. And as you know, one of the theories in setting up FYEs as a place in which you could test this was that being one credit, it would take some of the pressure off people, take some pressure off the students, and so that they would be able to think more freely and be a little bit more risk-taking. But I know in speaking with you, speaking with Hannah, and having taught FYE myself, that it also can have the exact opposite effect, which is people just don't do a whole lot of anything because the stakes are so low. So I wonder if you had any thoughts on that, and what you think a 3-credit course might look like for you to do it at that level, and what sorts of things one might add in order to flesh that course out. I mean, it's a wonderful textbook you're working with.
I think it was a bit
But with 2 more credits, you might want to have something else. Anyway.
At a 3-credit level,
well, first things first. What do you think about the sort of structural?
I think that's totally right. I think sometimes people did kind of show up with a little bit of like, well, here's 50 minutes. I'm gonna hang out for a bit, spin in my chair. But I mean, if I was in a setting that did try to raise the stakes a little bit and get people maybe more invested, probably not just sort of asking for samples, but also asking people to kind of prepare remarks about samples, or maybe like asking people to kind of introduce their fieldwork to the class rather than me being the one to kind of collect it and then sort of curate the examples. I could just let the students kind of do that themselves and maybe let them lead the discussion. That'd be a first try. Maybe something to kind of get people more involved. First step.
All right, well, hopefully our speakers will stick around for people who get to ask their questions, but let's thank them once again.